All right, thank you, Ray. Well, it's great to be here and to present. This is a presentation I've been giving around the state of Indiana for a couple years now, and the response has been pretty positive, and people want more information because obviously uh, heavy rainfall, flooding, and drought are impacting the entire United States. Doesn't matter where you live, you've experienced one or the other, and quite extensively. So, what I'm going to do today, the focus of the talk is on Indiana, but I have broadened it out to give you a little bit more feel for what's going on across the country. So you'll be able to look at your area of the country and pick out things and hopefully take something away from today's talk. All right, Ray, there we go. All right, now. So if you're not familiar with the drought.gov website, you might give it a visit. There's quite a bit of information, not only on drought, but also precipitation. These are a couple of images that I grabbed at the beginning of November, and it really shows the current state across the country. On the left there, you see areas of current drought. And of course, everyone knows the West has been dealing with drought for years. We're in what many call a mega drought. And despite recent rainfall, as you can see on the map on the right there, that's 60 to 8% of normal rainfall. The West got hammered pretty good by a couple atmospheric river systems that came off the Pacific. But just a few events are not enough to make a dent in that long-term drought. And we're seeing these extremes across the country going from extreme precipitation one season to uh, moderate to extreme drought the next season. And that's sort of what we're expecting in the future is a back and forth between these extremes. So it doesn't matter where you live, you're obviously going to be impacted one way or the other. So, some recent extreme rainfall events, these are just headlines, just a few of the headlines from over the last 6 months. I just quickly did a Google search to put these in, and I'm sure you can look through these. You may have been impacted by these, you may be nearby. I'm sure you heard it on the news. And you're probably saying, wait a minute, we were impacted in our area, but it's not on here. Well, again, there were just so many extreme rainfall events. It's tough to gather them all, but just a few on there. The atmospheric river, I already mentioned from the end of October. There were deadly floods in Alabama. We go back to August, just catastrophic flooding in Waverly, Tennessee. Just rainfall amounts that aren't meant to fall across the central United States, we're seeing more frequently. And that uh, our our rivers, our streams, our infrastructure just can't handle that amount of rainfall and the runoff that's being created. So we see these headlines over time. We look at a few events a little bit more closely here. Hurricane Ida in late August and early September. That impacted all the way from Louisiana up to New York and New England with just incredible rainfall amounts. Again, on such a scale that we haven't seen in the past. New York area, 1 day rainfall amounts between 6 and 9 inches. That is not supposed to happen outside of the tropics in the mid latitudes. But again, we're seeing that more frequently. New York City, over 3 inches of rain in 1 hour. And with a metro area with lots of concrete, that's all runoff. So that leads to quick flash flooding and over 40 fatalities from this one event in the New York City area. And New York City issued what in the Weather Service we call a flash flood emergency. It's the first time that was ever issued, and that was issued at the same time that tornado warnings were going off from the tornadoes from the remnants of that tropical system. So just a incredible weather event that moved up through the United States. I want to go down to the catastrophic flooding in Tennessee that I mentioned in August. 17 inches of rain in 24 hours, 9 to 10 of that in 12 hours. I heard reports even closer to 12 to 15 inches that fell in just a 12-hour period. Again, in the mountainous regions of Tennessee, that just leads to all kinds of runoff and just we're building in areas that experience this runoff where we in floodplains, and it just leads to these kind of disasters and catastrophes. So that's the one end of the spectrum. And then we turn to those of you out west, and you're like, where's the rain? We can't buy a drop of rain for years out here, and really it's not just in the West. As I showed you on that map, other parts of the country experience drought. We just simply hear about the West because of the extreme nature. You see a couple pictures there of the reservoirs and the river basins that are just down to the bare minimum. And the projections are for that to continue. And we hope we can just in intermediate years make up some of the deficit, but there's no end in sight for that drought out west. But then it expands to the central part of the country. We see these years where we have very heavy rain, and then the next year we can't buy rain and we go to drought. And so that's what we've seen. If we look back to May of 2009, that was a very wet spring across much of the country, including even the West. Um, but just devastating rainfall and flooding. Farmers couldn't get into the fields. And then we flip forward just a couple years to April. And while parts of the country are wet, a lot more areas of drought. And you can see the chart there at the top of the screen. That's a measure across the United States for the amount of drought or the amount of area that's above normal in precipitation. So the scale on the left is a percentage, and then it's the amount of percentage of the country in drought. The colors there will get darker and darker and darker. And for those areas that are seeing above normal rainfall, those colors are the cooler, the darker blues. So you can just see over time that it's pretty common to have these uh, oscillating periods between dry and wet. But what we're seeing is just a more intense, a shorter duration of these intense events as we move through the later years towards the current period. So when we zoom into Indiana, the same map here, and you can see those numbers a little better on the left-hand side, and then the years across the bottom. But if you sort of blur your eyes and you look at this chart, you see the extreme drought years. Of course, the Dust Bowl years in the 1930s stand out there. And then 1950 was a very wet year for Indiana. So you can see the darker blues. 100% of the state in that year was above normal with precipitation. But if you blur your eyes and just sort of look towards the current period there on the right, you can see the number of years with the dry conditions. While they're still there and there's still spikes where much of the state are in drought, some form of drought, there's been sort of a decrease from the mid to late 1990s. While at the same time, you can see the increase in all the blues and the greens there on the right, to the point of 2019 that was very wet, as I mentioned before, for the entire country, also for Indiana. So we're definitely in Indiana seeing a shift towards these more extreme wet precipitation years. So I just want to briefly show you some examples from Indiana of these recent significant precipitation events. This was from 2018, February 19th to 21st, a very wet 3-day period. So normal precipitation for Indiana is about 2 inches in February. It's our driest month of the calendar year. And in these particular 3 days, we saw between 6 and 8 inches of rain fall across the northern part of the state, and 1 to 2 inches in the central part of the state just in the 3 days. So we exceeded our normal precipitation in the north by over 800% of what we should normally see. So just an incredible amount of rainfall in a short duration. And of course, in February, everything is dormant. The growing season hasn't started out here yet. And a week before this heavy rainfall event, we actually had between 8 and 12 inches of snowfall, and that snow had just melted prior to this onset of rain. So that was about another 2 to 2.5 inches of liquid that had saturated the ground prior to the onset of this rainfall event. So the results were not very good for the state, with all kinds of flooding. Then we go back a little farther to June of 2015. This was an incredibly wet summer for much of the Midwest, as well as Indiana. But you can see here upwards of 15 inches above normal precipitation for the month of June. Normally we see around 4 to 4.5 inches of rainfall across the state. So that's 300 to 400% of normal. And then we moved into July, and the rain really didn't stop. Other These areas just doubled up 4 to 8 inches above normal, and that's 2 to 300% of normal. So what happens around the state when you get that kind of above normal precipitation? Well, this is one of our reservoirs in the north central part of the state called Mississinawa. That's Indiana State Road 13 that goes across there. And this is what it should look like on a typical summertime, and lots of boating, lots of recreation. Indiana Department of Natural Resources have parks and maintain this facility. But in 2015, this is what that reservoir looked like. That is the same bridge. That is full capacity for that reservoir. So if I can go back here, that's normal. And then that's what it ended up being, a record 40 feet above normal pool. The reservoir was effectively shut down for the entire season. DNR properties had quite a bit of damage, as you can imagine, had to be restored. So lots of lost revenue, not only for the reservoir and the park there, but for surrounding communities. That it's a very rural part of the state, so these communities rely on the income from visitors and tourists who come there to boat and fish and purchase things around the area. So pretty significant impact to the economy because of that one event. This is another nearby reservoir. This is J.E. Roush. On the left-hand side, that's pretty close to a normal summer pool. And on the right there, you can see the water all the way up to the top of this is the dam and a road that goes across the dam. And you can see it was at full capacity. They had to close the road because they weren't sure if the water was actually going to make it up to the road or not. But in both cases, the reservoirs did what they should. They held the water back. There was just minor flooding downstream, but it took a long time to allow this water to pass and get the levels down to normal pool. So everything functioned as it should, but both of these facilities were created back in the 1960s. And here's a list of the historic crest on this Roush Reservoir. And as you can look through there, you can see many of these recent historic crests have occurred in the last 20 to 30 years versus the first 30 years in the existence of these facilities. So as those crests keep increasing, the water, more runoff, more water comes in. It's from a design structure and engineering structure. Are we going to have to look at redoing some of these infrastructure projects, and is it going to handle what the future holds? And we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. So all of these events led to a lot of questions from partners across the state of Indiana, Department of Homeland Security, DNR. We have a very active Silver Jackets group here in Indiana. So the question was, we're seeing more flood events. We're seeing more water in these reservoirs. Is that because of more extreme rainfall? Well, as a scientist, we have to go and look at the data and actually prove that. So I did a study here, just a basic study, but I wanted to look back at stations where we had a very solid period of record. And so that led to 15 Weather Service cooperative weather sites that these are locations with volunteers who have been taking weather observations, in some cases all the way back into the 1800s. But we started this study right at 1900, went through 2020. And those sites you see in yellow across the state were ones we picked because there was very little missing data for those sites. So we could get a good picture of what the climate has done. And then the red sites are our first order climate sites. Those are major airports around the state. And I did pick Louisville, even though it's in Kentucky, because it's very close to the border and very representative of Southeast Indiana. So when we looked at that data, we wanted to compare it to our current climatological normal. So this gives you some idea what the current normals are for Indiana. So these just came out this past year. And generally, southern Indiana sees between 47 and 50 inches, while the northern part of the state are in the upper 30s to around 40 inches. And that's what we would expect an annual year to be. Now, keep in mind, these normals are updated every 10 years, and they look at a 30-year period of record. So you're always getting every 10 years a new set of normals to represent the current climate. So these numbers for the annual precipitation have been slowly increasing across the state. If you go back 40 or 50 years and look at the 30-year normals, they're about 6 to 7, 8 inches lower. And we're going to talk about why that is here in just a minute. So one of the first things I looked at was just said, okay, let's look at 2-day total precipitation for those 5 first order sites that I mentioned. Prior to automation, there was always someone on site there taking measurements. Now there's someone on site there with the automated sensors that take these measurements. So for each site, we plotted the top, basically 100 wettest 2-day periods on record. So on the left, you start at 1900, and then you go all the way over to the right to the current 2000, this data up through 2020. And what you see is sort of a nice clustering there up through about the 1990s. The data is very close together. Not a lot of big extreme events, just a few, as you would expect. But you can see once you get to 1990 to the present, the numbers start to expand. There's more variability there. And you just kind of draw a line there to outline that. So that visually you can now see there in the late 1900s, each of these sites started having more extreme rainfall events, upwards there for the Louisville site there, almost 12 inches on 2 different occasions for that 2-day precipitation total. So some pretty incredible changes over time as we've gone through the last 120 years. Then from there, we went down and we said, okay, how about the number of days per year with 1 inch or more precipitation? Pretty common across this area. So this was for all 20 sites. And you can see, again, a fairly uniform pattern there from left to right. And the green line is simply just a fitted trend line to those data points. But the red line is a 5-year moving average. And that 5-year moving average really tells the story. Ups and downs to be expected up through 1960, 1970, but really pretty uniform, pretty straight across the graph. But you can see that hinge point in the late 1970s where those number of 1-inch events really start to increase. And so you might say, okay, that's, maybe that's not that shocking. But then we go to the number of 2-inch events. So still fairly frequent, but not quite across the state. On average, 35 days a year where sites might experience this. But again, you see that hinge point now in the 1970s, a little steeper trend there, really starting to ramp up. And the years with some really high numbers. Look at that there, 2011, I believe that was, over 80 days at these sites, these 20 sites combined, experienced 2 inches or more of precipitation. So now that's starting to be pretty significant. If we go one step farther to 3 inches, obviously the same trends there. You see that steep incline now from about 1980 or so, and that upward trend. And again, more clustering of the extreme events up there around the 15-day mark for these 20 stations. So then we said, okay, let's look at the big events. Let's look at when there was 5 inches or greater. Well, remember these sites, they all have an 8-inch diameter rain gauge to catch precipitation. So the odds of catching a rainfall event over one of these 8-inch gauges, it's going to be tough. But in this case, the data was pretty uniform for every decade up to the 1980s, generally between about 3 and 5 events per decade at these sites with 5 inches or greater. But remember those hinge points we talked about when we got to the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010 to 19, those numbers, jumped to at least 6. And 2000 to 2009 was very wet. 11 of the 20 stations had, over half of these stations all experienced a 5-inch or greater rainfall event. My hopes in the future is to actually look at radar data, and we get rainfall estimates from the radar data, and maybe try and go back and fill in the gaps between these locations that's actually catching the precipitation, and see if we can't find even more data to support this increases. Because I know I've worked events where you've had these thunderstorms produce 7, 8, 9 inches of rain. We just had one this summer in Bloomington, Indiana, 7 inches of rain in 12 hours. But the rain gauges were just situated so that we only had a few volunteer observers catch that core of the rainfall. So when we look at trends over the last 120 years, we look at a rate of change. It's a statistical analysis of the data. And we look at that entire period from 1900 to 2020. We look at our climate locations across the state. Indiana is divided into 9 climate divisions. So you can see those divisions there on the map. And that rate of change for 30-year periods, the data suggests that the rainfall amounts annually are increasing by these amounts across the state every 30 years. So for West Central Indiana, every 30 years, if you just look at a straight trend line, you're seeing about an 1.5 inch increase of precipitation. When you look at that data on a shorter time period where that hinge point we talked about started, so in this case, we're going to look from 1960 to 2020. Now that rate of change every 30 years is projected much higher. We're looking at anywhere from 2 to over 4 inches of increase in rainfall every 30 years. So that is a pretty substantial increase that we've seen just in these last 60 years compared to the entire period of record. So the future climate projections I'm going to show here in the next few slides support what we're seeing already as future projections moving forward. So we're going to have to anticipate, at least around Indiana and nearby states in the Midwest, these increasing annual rainfall events and extreme rainfall events. So from the 4th National Climate Assessment, you can pick out your location across the country. And if you want to read more about this, I encourage you to read this publication. But this simply looked at the changes in that top 1% of precipitation events between 1958 and 2016. And, oh, somebody's controlling my slides there. Thank you. You can see the Great Lakes and the Northeast is where the greatest change in these extreme events have been happening. And again, we go back to Ida, Hurricane Sandy, the Northeast there. I've showed you for Indiana, and that's reflected for the Midwest. And even out west where we're having those droughts, you've experienced extreme rainfall events. That October event was an extreme rainfall event sandwiched right in the middle of this mega drought. So we're definitely seeing, again, the extreme events from dry to wet across the entire country. Do I still have control here, Ray?
You do. Yeah. Wiggle the mouse. Thank you.
Okay, there it goes. So for Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment brought up extreme events for Indiana. And again, you can just see that trend. The numbers are there. This is the top 1% of precipitation events for Indiana, and a definite increase moving through there. And
right back at you here. Hang on.
Yeah. There we go. So we look at the National Climate Assessment from 2014. They actually looked at they broke the regions out for the country. So again, you can go to this assessment and see your region. But these are the projected changes in very heavy precipitation. Indiana and Ohio and parts of Michigan really on the high end for these increasing days. But drought, the number of consecutive days of dry weather are expected to increase, especially over the southwest part of the area, Missouri into Illinois and southwest Indiana. So again, just what we've talked about, more dry days, but more rainfall, more extreme events. So we're going to see this precipitation falling in shorter period of time, but in a lot more quantity. So just some questions and challenges that I pose when I give this talk sometimes. You all know what your challenges are. You can be thinking about your infrastructure, your dams, your streams, whatever it is, but we're going to need to be ready for this increasing extremes in precipitation. So I just real quick before questions, I want to end here. As part of the National Weather Service, we have a program called Weather Ready Nation. And if your business organization is promoting awareness for weather and climate and resilience, you should be recommended or recognized for that. And the Weather Service wants to recognize you. So you can go to this website, put in your organization information, and your local National Weather Service will recognize you then as an ambassador for amplifying our word, but also for protecting lives and property and trying to mitigate future hazards from extreme weather events. So get yourself signed up and get rewarded for the work you're doing. We really appreciate the help in that. So with that, I thank you. I hope you've learned a lot for your part of the country, and happy to take any questions here.
Well, Sam, thank you for the amount of time you put into preparing the wonderful program. Certainly did shine some light on some of the things that we're working with right now. And I know you've got your prepared presentation. Is there anything, you got a message now you can get out to just north of 200 folks all scattered across the nation, and you gave us some very good food for thought. And in fact, going to go back a couple of slides here, and I think you gave us 2 calls of action here, but you also gave us some calls of action here. Any more points you want to make regarding to these 200 folks about what we can do to prepare?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what can you do? Just you've seen it. Everyone has seen it and experienced it. Depending on where you're at, whether it's the extreme drought that's going to continue, or these precipitation events that are going to continue and overwhelm our infrastructure. What can you do now? What measures can you take to help mitigate that moving forward? We always seem to react after the event. Money comes in the millions and the billions after a big event, but what can we do before that happens to mitigate that? So your National Weather Service is always a resource. We work with state agencies, federal agencies, all partnering together just to try to get the word out to people, keep people safe, and keep them out of harm's way. We know it's going to happen. We just have to try and mitigate it.
Yeah, just the pictures from our Pacific Northwest, right? We're going from no rain, no rain, no rain to, pulling Coast Guard, pulling people out of their cars and whatnot because of the serious flooding. So here
Yeah.
comes a couple of questions. So
Okay.
how does the rate of urbanization increase in the impervious surface factor into the runoff and impact of extremes in rainfall? I've been hearing about the concept of urban rain, where the presence of the city actually causes unique local rainfall events.
Yeah, so that's being studied. There's a lot of research papers out there to support that. We're downstream of these urban heat island areas. You see an increase in rainfall, but yeah, the urban footprint, concrete, asphalt, the runoff from that. Now, some of the mitigation is to build more retention ponds, bigger retention ponds, more green areas, more wetlands to slow that water runoff. But it just, you can only slow it so much. But that's the mitigation efforts that's having success with these large wetlands or big retention ponds. Just slow that water down and allow the rivers and streams to do their jobs. And I know in some areas those same waterways are filling in with silt. So best practices for farming and conservation can help eliminate that or slow that down so that the rivers and streams can do what they're meant to do.
Sure. And a follow-up question, it really is with all the trends showing the increased number and intensity of storms in the future and the trends of increased size of those storms, should the design of the new flood control dams and rehabilitation projects be based on a higher design frequency storms rather than the base of the design storms on the data from the past 30 years? So it's moving so fast. So we start changing what we need to do.
And that's definitely
Design.
the topic for conversation. That's a little outside my lane, but NOAA does produce a precipitation frequency atlas where you can see what the 50-year, 100-year, 200-year, 500-year rainfall event is and the frequency that you should see that. But I know a lot of designers have told me they designed for that 100-year frequency,
Mhm.
and we seem to be hitting that 100-year mark more like every 25 to 50 years in parts of the country. So I
Yeah.
think that is definitely worth looking at. But as one engineer told me, we would love to build to that, but that costs more money, and nobody wants to spend that money to build to that structure. So
So
that's
we
the
had
conversation for others.
excellent. And we had one come in from the chat. Please use the questions and answers area. That'll help us. And I know Sam's going to stay with us and answer in writing some of these questions that have came in. There are several amazing RCPP projects that help slow spread the sink, soak, and store the water in the upland watersheds. This helps convert flooding liabilities into groundwater assets. So just a comment by one of our participants.
Yeah, and that's great. And wouldn't it be great if we could take all that extra water from one part of the country and move it to the other part of the country that's needed? Wouldn't that be a
Yeah,
fantastic thing? But
that would
that
be
that won't happen in my lifetime.
right. Thanks, Sam. And kind of a follow up to that too. The one individual said you mentioned bigger structures, but what about adding a buffer stage?
Yeah, I mean, again, a little outside my lane as a meteorologist, but I've heard talk of that. Absolutely, buffer anything to slow that water down.
Yeah, it really helps a lot, doesn't it? And another comment here from one of our participants, and I'll have you probably answer this in writing, but seems like we don't design for the larger storm events now. It will cost millions to billions of dollars later to repair and rehab and fix. And boy, that one bridge, that startling bridge site, right, that you showed. Here's what
Mm.
it looks like normally. Here's what it looks like, after a big event. So talk about that, the design now for larger storm events versus the amount of money we're going to spend later.
Yeah, and again, a little outside my lane, but those structures, I want to say they all worked exactly as they were designed to. There was
Yeah,
no problems. The flooding downstream was mitigated, but
yeah,
can those structures do that in 30 years when
right.
these events are happening more frequently, more intense?
Mhm.
Um, Again, that's the structural engineer's
Right.
conversation that needs to be had, and beyond what I'm capable of providing at this point.